Good evening, everyone. My name is Inderbir Singh Riar, and I'm an associate professor in the Azrieli School of Architecture and Urbanism at Carleton University. And I'm delighted to welcome you to an evening that goes straight to the heart of architectural knowledge, namely to the possession of artifacts, drawings, models, photographs, and what the values of authorship, ownership, and stewardship mean when establishing history and truth today. This year's forum and open forum lectures come from the founding sponsor's commitment to situate architecture as a matter of public concern. Speakers have arrived from points near and far, whether Chile, Korea, or Canada. The calendar continues this month with United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing, Balakrishnan Rajagopal, and Indigenous Australian architect Jack Gilmer. It's quite a closing lineup, and we look forward to seeing you at all events. Tonight's lecture, like all others, occurs on traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. Such acknowledgement points partly to the knotty problem of ownership, quite simply, in whose name are past, present, and future written. Or, put differently, who are the proper custodians of cultural patrimony? Who gets to shape public memory? Who gets to preserve material removed from original sites of creation? Who, in other words, gets to keep something and to care for it? Such questions define the norms and forms of modern museums. Most of the museums that we visit, or at least the big ones, rest on a fundamental premise: to establish theories of origins, however real or invented. We remain thus in the orbit of 18th century encyclopedic visions that fueled 19th century ambitions of turning cultures and peoples and traditions into museological facts. Ensuing imperial projects, driven in part by trading missions, military expeditions, and archaeological excavations, empowered the discoverer, not least the armchair expert or the curator, to speak on behalf of the so-called discovered. Spurious racial science codified claims to superiority and inferiority. The long-term consequences of such powerful and indeed monumental concentrations of knowledge color the work of our speaker this evening. Martien de Vletter is Associate Director and Head of Collections at the Canadian Centre for Architecture in Montreal. She joined the CCA in 2012 after serving as Chief Curator at the Netherlands Architecture Institute and as publisher of Sun Architecture in Amsterdam. Martien's museum work does not focus simply on artifacts. She instead is consumed by developing long-term intellectual and technical strategies of making archives accessible. A pioneering effort examines the so-called born digital, or objects that distinguish architecture production of the last 30 years. The resulting paradigm, at least for Luddites like me, is simple and shocking. Paper can last, computer files can disappear. We, however, live in an age driven by the awesome potential of generating and storing data, a giant extension to the museological missions of preserving and educating. With this comes equally awesome responsibility that animates the Canadian Centre for Architecture's changing custodial purpose. This responsibility returns to the age-old issue of provenance. Provenance, simply put, is ownership over time. Studying provenance allows understanding how and why and for whom a work of art was created. The same search can reveal difficult ethical and legal stories behind acquisitions, which of course include robbery and theft. Martien and her team are committed to reconsidering provenance. They are working toward alternative methods of how museums or museum resources are made public. The mantra is to connect rather than to collect. This profound reorientation challenges museums to reimagine ways of unlocking the past, of handing down generational awareness, and of forming a canon. With this comes potential acts of repatriation and reconciliation. As Martien puts it, the shift lies in moving from the known custodial tradition to a new relational paradigm in which creators keep their work and museums provide institutional support. One already imagines the ripple effects on the standard equipment of museums: wall texts, catalog entries, display techniques, accession numbers, loans, donations, insurance adjustments, and gift shop merchandise. Everything suddenly up for grabs and redefinition. In this call to action, And in this spirit of challenging museums and curators, please join me in welcoming Martien de Vletter to the podium.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Inebir, for organizing this lecture. Thank you all for coming. I will talk about two projects, specifically, that we're working on at the CCA in the collection later on. But I will start with explaining a little bit what we do with CCA. I'm not assuming that every one of you has been there or has been there recently. But I would like to begin this talk by recognizing the long-standing connections of indigenous peoples to Tiohtià:ke, Munyang, Montreal, and in particular the Kanien'kehá:ka people of Kahnawake, Kanesatake, and Akwesasne, whose ancestors, along with those of the Wendat, Anishinaabe, and the Abenaki communities lived on the lands that the CCA now occupies, long before the arrival of settlers. Still today, the island is home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. These communities continue to face challenges to their rights and the erosion of their traditional territories as a result of ongoing processes of rights of settler colonialism. The CCA puts on exhibitions and events, maintains its collections, and publishes text on these lands that never have been ceded by their indigenous inhabitants. And the CCA therefore recognizes its settler colonial roots, and we are committed to fostering long-term affirmative relationships with indigenous peoples across Tiohtià:ke, Munyang, Montreal, and beyond. And I invite you to learn more about CCA's ongoing commitment to our living land acknowledgement process by visiting our website or contacting us directly. And if you do visit the website, you will see that this is a project by Angie Loft, an architect from Kahnawake that we worked with and who has done several interventions at the CCA. Okay, but let's continue. Let's start, as I said, with a brief introduction of what we do and therefore also what we collect. I always say that the CCA is the Canadian Centre for Architecture, but it's not the Centre for Canadian Architecture. And this is a subtle difference. And it doesn't mean that we don't work on Canadian content. It certainly doesn't mean that we don't have any Canadian content in our collection. But I think it should be seen through the lens of international research and international architecture. I will talk today mainly about the collection, and the activities around and coming from the collection. Collecting, which reflects the institutional activities, and the other way around, include many, but certainly not only, but still many materials from North America and Europe, while at the same time always addressing and seeing architecture from a transnational perspective. Our collection is not encyclopedic, and we constantly reflect on our priorities, geographies, and societal issues to be addressed, or reflecting on our own past actions. Our exhibitions and research projects often drive to rethink the collection and the other way around. And the first image you saw is of a project called Out of the Box, which is a series of exhibitions on one specific archive. In this case, it's the archive of Amancio Williams, an architect from Buenos Aires, whose archive we received from the family. And instead of doing one big monographic show, we prefer to invite multiple people, and so to create different narratives and different thematics. So I can see these exhibitions, we always have three, rather as a thematic show than it is a monographic show. The first one that we did was with Studio Moto from Paris. They were interested in the horizon, the idea of the horizon in the work of Amancio Williams. The second one was with an art historian, Claudia Schmid from Buenos Aires, who was very invested in, let's say, to understand the network of this Amancio Williams, who became famous in Argentina, first of all, because he worked on a house together with Le Corbusier. And the third exhibition was a project with Pezo and von Ehrlichhausen, who were interested in his only built project, House Over the Bridge, which I think you can see here, yeah, up there, the house, the house over the creek, which is a kind of bridge house. It's his own house, and it was the only thing he built, which we have in the archive. And his work, all his other projects are imaginary or trying to do things. He never succeeded. This is a whole story in itself that I won't get into tonight. Also a trilogy is the work that we do now called, this is an exhibition called Into the Island, which is about this is the first exhibition, and the second exhibition is up now, I have to say. And this first exhibition is about let's say, the influence of law and regulations on architecture, or not. And in this case, Xu Qianqian, Chinese architect, really interesting woman, she was asked to do a big building, a big touristic, or building for tourists, because this island is between China mainland and Taiwan and hosts over, let's say, 2 million tourists every year because of the goddess of the sea that they adore, and they have lots of, let's say, holy and events around. And she, instead of proposing a building, she tried to convince the local government to work on to reinforce, let's say, the qualities of the island themselves. So she worked on oysters, let's say the oyster industry, she worked on the seaweed industry, and she worked on the mangrove industry. And part of this exhibition is film. Actually, film is the exhibition, I would say. You can see them online, but you can also see them in the exhibition. And the film is actually a really important tool for us. The second iteration of this trilogy around law is called To Build Law, which is a reflection, or let's say a work, again a film, on a campaign that is currently going on in Europe, House Europe. This is called to gain or to collect 1 million signatures in order to have a proposed bill to be discussed in the European Parliament. And this whole effort is to in a way, to reinforce, let's say, renovation, and to make sure that law and regulations will stimulate renovation rather than demolition and rebuilding structures. So again, this is also about how you use or not use or try to navigate law and regulations. The last one will open in May. I won't say much about it, but what holds it together is the use of film. As I said, is for us, every time we do a project, it's really about which is the best format for an exhibition, and in this case we thought film was important. In general, our idea of exhibitions is to ask ourselves questions, and rather than presenting an oeuvre of an architect, as I said, or addressing a typology or something. Also, quite unique, I would say, is to often address architecture through societal issues. So a lot of people come to the CCA with the expectations to see a lot of drawings and a lot of models, and they're often very disappointed, and we get a lot of critique for that because they see other things. Such as our exhibition on happiness, which showed many other things influencing architecture, but not necessarily the architecture itself. And similarly with imperfect health, of which you see now here a page of the book, just to show you that we also do a lot of publications. With all the projects we do, whether they're exhibitions, publications, research projects, or collection projects, and in addition to our mandate to make architecture a public concern, we develop projects that intentionally are transformative for the institution. Not all the projects are like that, but there are two in particular that I will point out. Clearly, and I think Inderweer already mentioned it, the archaeology of the digital project about the question, the influence, let's say, to investigate the influence of the computer in architecture, and some of the questions we asked ourselves is when did it actually start, the digital in architecture, was really transformative for the collection. It meant we had to collect born digital materials to understand how to preserve it. I will not go into that subject today. But I think this project, Archaeology of the Digital, with 3 exhibitions, with publications, e-publications, we learned many things, and it was a really transformative project for the institution. And so while the archaeology of the digital had an impact on how we do things, I think a more recent project towards home influenced very much the way of thinking, and that goes back to the land acknowledgement I started with in the beginning. This was one of the first steps towards addressing how the CCA, as a cultural institution, has been replicating and perpetuating colonial and settler dynamics, and how to identify and foreground voices and subjects that have not been recognized. The methodology, asking questions again, and asking it through societal issues, is not so different from the other projects, but I think the impact for the institution is much more intense than some other projects. These 2 projects, the one Archaeology of the Digital and this one, will have a long-lasting effect. The collaboration with the co-curators, indigenous co-curators that is, and working with the 10 indigenous students, of which you see the work in the next slide, I think. There you go. From the north has led to new ways of seeing and new ways of understanding architecture. It also meant that the work of the 10 students became the first indigenous acquisition to the CCA, because they all donated the work they produced through different workshops in Canada, but also in Sapmi. It has an impact on our curatorial projects and our thinking in the collection, which brings me to the actual subject of tonight. At the CCA, we consider the collection as a repository of ideas, provocations, inspirations, trials, and errors. The collection documents the culture and production of architecture worldwide, from the Renaissance through the present day, and it's made up of interrelated bodies of primary and secondary materials. I invite you all to come and see it. Currently, the CCA has 227 archives that you see are stored more or less like this, not all, but you see models on the right, you see the rolls further on, boxes with all kinds of correspondence and textual documentations. We also have a collection of prints and drawings, of which you see, here you see a Cedric Price archival drawing, of which I think there's lots to see and lots to learn from the Fun Palace project, which, by the way, is the most popular project of the CCA in terms of loans, and also in terms of reproductions, and also in terms of requests in the study room. But we also have a collection of prints and drawings, of which you see here the Palladio drawing, a photography collection which is very large and is interesting because it shows not necessarily iconic buildings or iconic photographers, famous photographers or anything. Actually, it's the opposite. It's often landscapes, urban landscapes, from a, of course, very specific angle of the photographer. We also have a library with monographs and periodicals, as you see here. Unfortunately, if you come to the CCA, you're not allowed to go through the stacks. You have to request everything in the study room and it will be brought to you. But we have audiovisual, born digital material, toys, games, miniature, posters, postcards, you name it. And everything is available for consultation in our study room, as you see it here, and you can search for all the material online. However, for the CCA, it is never really about what we have, but what you do with it and how you activate it, considering, let's say, the current disciplinary and cultural issues. As contemporary issues are changing constantly, our thinking of how to activate the collection is too, and our standards for descriptions, that I will talk about now, of the collections are changing. And the first project I want to talk about in more detail is the critical cataloging project, and I will address the Find and Tell project after. So we have been collecting ideas on architecture since 1979, with the goal of building up a productive research resource for researchers worldwide. All material that enters the collection is recorded. Books, toys, miniatures are catalogued in a library database. Photography, prints and drawings are recorded in an object management database. And archival holdings are described in finding aids. Descriptions are created to identify objects or groups of materials, to manage and track materials, for example, if they go on loans and so forth, and ultimately to make them accessible for research. And as Inderbeer was pointing out, museums are increasingly being questioned about both the provenance of their collections and their description practices. Are museums neutral, and can descriptions really be considered objective? As they are argued, we have been arguing for a long time. The modern museum itself was established as part of a colonial cultural system that removed artifacts from their original context and made them available to often a very select group of people. And yet, the museum is also a space within which to consider and re-examine cultural entities and its policies and process of collecting and describing. And I think the museum specifically is a great place to do this with the public. To be honest, I have to say, I never considered that being a custodian of architects' archives and of photographs or acquiring books and periodicals was a colonial act in the context of the CCA. And yet we have undeniably contributed to establishing the canon of whiteness in architecture, meaning a lot of our material is created by white men. In our collecting strategies, certain concepts, peoples and genders have been privileged over others. And it is now imperative to revisit this strategy of collecting in light of this realization and when and how we describe projects. Descriptions are typically produced when the objects they describe enter the collection, and they tend to become permanent, unchanged, even when new research on the objects become available. For areas of knowledge with terms that evolve rapidly, such as studies related to gender, cataloging processes cannot constantly adopt or adapt, as it would simply require too much research and resources. Collection descriptions are therefore never entirely up to date and are thus themselves historical records. For a long time, we did not question how descriptions could perpetuate injustice or exclusion, but this has changed. We are now working to expand descriptions to make otherwise underrepresented yet relevant aspects of an object's history accessible and, more importantly, discoverable. Descriptive practices are not as neutral as we long thought they were. In their 2002 introduction of archival science, photography specialist Joanne Swartz and archivist Terry Cook write that modernist thinking led to the positive notion of describing as a neutral act and of the archivist as an impartial, honest broker between creator and researcher. However, as they go on to write, postmodern archival thinking requires the profession to accept that it cannot escape the subjectivity of performance by claiming the objectivity of systems and standards. And I can tell you that when I came to the CCA in 2012, the archivist certainly thought he was making objective descriptions. The CCA's cataloging and description standards now cause issues pertaining to a hierarchy of sameness, a phrase coined by Hope Olson, a professor of information studies who examines the biases inherent to the classification systems. Why are we actually concerned with making descriptions inclusive and just? Collection descriptions are key for discovering sources and ideas, increasing access, and therefore advancing knowledge. Descriptions are also contextual and framed by geography and time. Questioning our description can support changes in research practices and in long accepted but perhaps biased concepts. Cataloging processes and the production of collection descriptions are as much the outcome as the enabler of research, and so must always be open to revision. Because object descriptions are not frequently revisited or revised, and because online descriptions are easier to find than research published in academic publications, those writing new object descriptions must be much more aware of the impact of narratives, assumptions, and patterns. Language matters, and even more so in our digital world with language-based algorithms. And I just want to point out that this photograph by Walker Evans, so originally it was called in our database slave quarters, and we started to revisit that and look at that, actually in a way alarmed by the word slave, but then we also started to question the word quarter. So the CCA critical cataloging project, because that's what I'm talking about, started in September 20. Reviews of our current object descriptions and can be used as a model for the CCA wider collecting practices. Critical cataloging intends to incorporate an inclusive description and metadata strategies to improve the discoverability, because if you don't add more words to a description, and you would look for housing, for example, you would not find this photograph if it is not described as housing. The project began by identifying the most harmful language used in records across the CCA collection. This includes words like slave, Indian, albino, and servant. And we moved on to revise constructed titles, which means it's not the title that the artist gave, but it's constructed by catalogers. And in records of the photography collection. And so, as I said, the slave quarters became eventually housing for enslaved people. We are continuously working on critically investigate insensitive, racist, and harmful language to augment collection descriptions with additional information that provides access to underrepresented cultures, groups, or individuals. To properly credit all those involved in the works to the ongoing practice of critical and ethical cataloging, as well as an audit of our finding aids for the archive. And the description of this photograph, for example, gave very little information and actually was also inaccurate and incorrect, and therefore was very difficult to find. And so the group did a lot of research, and we talk a lot together to make it a more, let's say, to allow for better description. Now, this also becomes a problem because we cannot, let's say, do research on all the 60,000 photographs that we have. So you have to be precise, and you have to also understand that we're an architecture institution and we're not an anthropological institution. We don't have all the knowledge. Sometimes we reach out to other institutions, but we also have to be careful not to go down in a rabbit hole and never come out of it. So this is a complex, let's say, process. But it can help us to question our own biases, personal, institutional, and systemic. And though the revision of object records and descriptions typically is the responsibility of librarians, catalogers, and archivists, we collaborate also with our colleagues in exhibitions, programs, and publications. And they have joined us in this whole project. Right. Now we get to another big project, which in a way came after the critical, or let's say developed a little bit after the Finding and Tell, the critical cataloging project, which enters this post-custodial or non-custodial approach. Because ethical questions around the collection are not just about description. It starts, of course, with acquisitions and about what to include in the collection and what not. So when we started to discuss with scholars of our project centering Africa, the question if collecting material from the African continent was considered an ethical act or not, most of the scholars said it was not. To them, extracting archives created in and about Africa and including them in the CCA's collection will reiterate a colonial act, even if the CCA is considered perhaps a safe haven, or even if it is a way to salvage those archives, it would still constitute an unethical act. So this led to a conversation and deep thinking on my end on other possible models. Deposits is one model, where the CCA takes care of materials as long as they are at the CCA and they will be returned when, for example, a new institution or an institution can take care of them. And post-custodial care is another. This was a really complex and intense conversation, I have to say, because we have archives from all around the world, so why can we accept the archive of Álvaro Siza from Portugal, but not from an architect in Africa or from Africa? The post-custodial approach could take many forms. The archival community, for example, is discussing if one way of understanding this approach could be for materials to remain in their place of origin, while external archivists provide management oversight. This represents a shift from the custodial tradition, where records are maintained by archives and collections, to an alternative model where records are retained by their creator, with archives providing oversight and support functions. And although the post-custodial theory asserts that archivists can no longer hold custody of all the records that might come under their care, nor does the theory suggest that custody will totally disappear. So it's finding a kind of balance in between. Digital technology presents, and that's interesting considering our previous project, Archaeology of the Digital, but it presents an interesting opportunity for participatory and post-custodial approaches that seek to shift curatorial authority and access to communities represented. In this model, archivists and curators work side by side with community members to actively close gaps in historical coverage and proactively document the present day. At the same time, digitized material has the potential to reach other audiences beyond the physical space of a library or a study room. And a prominent and by now famous institutional example of this approach, where I learned a lot from, is the University of Texas Libraries, who partnered with organizations in several countries to digitally document human rights struggles, the records of which are often very fragile and susceptible to loss. This work includes the Human Rights Documentation Initiative, the Genocide Archives of Rwanda, and the Digital Archive of the Guatemalan National Police Historical Archive. Activists in the US and Canada are also collaborating with data scientists and many others to archive vulnerable government data related to climate change and other areas of current political contention, although I'm not sure how this is going at this point in time. Technology has democratized access in many ways, introducing a proliferation of open access tools and participatory initiatives. The post-custodial model of archival practice is supported by digital technology in pursuit of a more collaborative approach to transnational archival work. On the other hand, the digital divide is real. Online access does not necessarily mean improved access for everyone, nor should it be mistaken for digital preservation in and of itself. Moreover, there are significant ethical considerations, because when we digitize a collection, who is doing that labor? And what about the communities that do not want their information to be publicly available? So this really requires careful consideration and engagement of those ethical issues, and it is a crucial component of the work that we do. And with this in mind, we started a project, Find and Tell, elsewhere, and we only call it elsewhere because it's not at the CCA, where we also have a Find and Tell project, and you all may recognize the hands of Inderbeer here in this photograph. We invite people to come to the CCA and to curious minds, not necessarily the expert, and to work with us on selections of materials to be digitized, which we put online. There's much more to say about it, but I just want to mention it because the methodology is, that we have developed together is actually now applied in a different way. Because we wanted to explore in which the CCA does not gain ownership, as I said, to an archive, but would increase access to material that would otherwise not be easily and globally accessible. And to carry out and stimulate research, while at the same time apply our reparative description lessons learned. Digitization is the tool to allow for access and further research, and we consider at this point Wikimedia as the principal platform for granting access. I'll get to that, while the CCA website plays the role of a platform for editorial and curatorial initiatives. The advantage of Wikimedia is that the additional descriptions may be included in a language different from the standard of the CCA, French and English, allowing other communities to study and write about this material. And in other words, to place the material in the public domain, we feel that we take care of the material, but we shift from collecting, meaning owning, to connecting, a post-custodial or perhaps even a non-custodial model. So we have just launched the second project, which we have been doing in collaboration with Professor Warebi Brizebe from Lagos, or actually River State University. And Warebi proposed to focus on the first generation of post-independence Nigerian architects like Michael Olutosin Onafakwan, which you see here on your left. Is that? Yeah. He and his contemporaries were responsible for many of the early post-colonial building projects in Nigeria during the 1960s and the oil boom years of the 1970s. Their works have become major landmarks and national monuments in Nigeria. Brizebe and his team are collecting the drawings from the estate of the architect, digitizing and describing the material. We do this together, so we have endless Zoom meetings to discuss this, from which, of course, we learn a lot. And initially they were told by the family that there was no material. This is always the case. As I've been told this many, many times. And then when visiting the family of the architect, it turned out that there was a lot. And architect Yinka Williams, that you see here, part of the team, and herself a daughter of another protagonist of this generation, found very interesting material. And the family allowed the team, because of gaining, I think, trust, including Luther King, Usuru, and Abigail Duke, to make a selection and digitize. And you can see here in the Methodist Church, one of the digitized images or drawings, and a hospital. So we work together, as I said, on the descriptive metadata and uploading the files to Wikimedia. So we don't own the images. The images stay with the team. I have no idea what they do with it, but we upload it in Wikimedia, and we wrote together text for the Wikipedia pages. And this effort will make the legacy of Nigeria's early independence architects known to a wider public and the diaspora, while the CCA will publish articles from scholars on our website. And we just published the first article written by Luther King, which I think was also his first international publication. But we started this project in 2021 by collaborating with the custodians of the papers of the Sudanese architect Abdelmouna Mustafa to examine his significant interventions in Khartoum and surroundings and his role in the architecture of nation building in Sudan. Architecture historian Ezra Akjan, who was the CCA Research Fellow in 2019, was our liaison. The custodian of the Mustafa papers, the Office of Technocon Engineering Consultancies in Khartoum, digitized a significant selection of the material in 2021, around 40% of, I think, what was left of the papers. And they have been documenting and selecting of still existing buildings, so they were sending a photographer around the city to document that you will see here too, the photographs. And in close collaboration with them, we made a substantial body of digitized material, including the Savings Bank in Khartoum, the Arab Bank for Economic Development, and residential projects in Khartoum available in Wikimedia. And in doing this work, we have become aware of what Christian Kelleher coined as conflicting desiderata. He writes, American and European derived archival standards and practices and assumptions may be prescriptive and inflexible when confronting cultural circumstances and purposes different from those they were originally intended for. The rationales of the global north and implications for the global south of appraisal, acquisition, arrangement, and descriptions of archives to Western standards or providing access with Western freedoms in mind need to be explicitly considered, or they may be implicitly adopted as a result of unequal power structures. So we are very mindful of setting the agenda together, not unlike any of the other projects we do, but maybe just more. And we certainly learned a lot from our Indigenous-led project Towards Home, meaning leaving the decision from the selection of material with our collaborators in Khartoum and in Lagos and count on their expertise and be mindful of their timeline rather than ours. An attitude that Michelle Caswell and Marika Chifor described in their book From Human Rights to Feminist Ethics as Radical Empathy, and that I find interesting. In addition, we worked on creating a Wikipedia page, which is an exercise in biased thinking, patience, and not giving up. The biographical text for long was not accepted, as it lacked citations according to the Wikipedia standards. So this is not Wikimedia. Abdelmullah Mustafa may be one of the most important architects in Sudan, yet he is not recognized as such in the world of Wikipedia. But we managed it together to get it up. It was very complicated. And here too we published an article by Ezra on the CCA website and making a selection of the archive available to the broader public and the diaspora. I will also say that we have no idea what the situation of the archive is. We did this project we completed it just before the war broke out in Sudan. We know that the people that we worked with are safe, not in Sudan. But none of us, including them, they have no idea what the situation of the archive is. And this makes actually the material uploaded on Wikimedia even more valuable. So to conclude, this approach signifies a different relationship between collecting, research and programming. And I have to tell you that explaining to our board was very complex because they did not understand why we would invest money and resources and energy and time of all of us and not having the material. This concept, it took quite a while to convince them. While a growing network of scholars at the CCA and elsewhere will gain from this project. For us, it means positioning the institution as an agent and facilitating discovery and access to materials while supporting different knowledge productions within a larger and diverse scholar network. So I think in that sense, one of the possible future of archives is to connect rather than to collect. Thank you.
Martien has very graciously will open the floor to questions, so don't be shy and raise your hand. Way in the back.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. So as you're going through this process of restructuring curation in a less problematic way, let's put it, I noticed a lot of those solutions end up being to move towards some form of digitization. Totally understanding all of the many issues that come with the past ways of curation of physical objects, is there a way to still have a physical aspect to curation while going forward in a more thoughtful and equitable way?
I would say yes, but I'm wondering if I understand the question. So you mean in this particular project, for example, or?
Yeah, unless I misunderstood some of the projects went through. A lot of the more equitable methods of curation focus on moving into the digital world, which is a totally incredible tool that we have now. But I was wondering, is there still a way to have people be able to connect to some sort of physical aspect in, say, like a real space, while still tackling those issues of provenance and ownership and inequity in the territory?
Yeah, definitely. I think, let's say, I think the work we do is really multi-layered, and there's not, one size fits all. And this is something that I learned very quickly at the CCA. There's many ways of doing, and this is also the incredible thing at the CCA, that we are allowed and we can allow ourselves to different ways of doing and take the time. But yes, the physical objects are still very important and still very accessible. And it's very funny in a way that so our study room is still consulting. Many people come and they want to see the physical materials, and for example, our Born Digital collection, the collection that we collected during these years of archaeology of the digital, in which we collected 25, at least a little bit more actually, 25 projects created. It was a selection by the curator Greg Lynn, and this all Born Digital material it's a paradox. You can only come and see at the CCA on very specific computers, standalone computers and all that, because we promised to the donors, where most of them still alive, that people could not copy the drawings for, the Erasmus Bridge in Rotterdam. And so let's say so to not stimulate plagiarism or something. So, but that's access to born digital material. But your question about physical materials, yeah, this is a very interesting question, because what I think in the Find and Tell project, for example, is definitely what we do at the CCA, the Find and Tell project, inviting people to make selections of within an archive. So, for example, we invite someone to make a selection within the Álvaro Siza archive. The archive has 70,000 drawings. So there's no way that we can or want digitize everything. So you want to have a kind of curatorial approach. So the person comes, make the selection based on physical material. And what I see is that the moment you publish this online, there is more interest for the same materials often, that's the pity, but also for the other materials. Now the ethical question that I ask myself in relation to this project that we do with our African colleagues, first in Khartoum and then now in Lagos, and we're going to move on to Dakar in this year, because we're not taking care of the physical documents. And you can also question this, of course, because we take very good care of the Álvaro Siza archive. So this is a kind of problem we have not. We have decided not to take care, actually, specifically because the scholars were so. They really said you shouldn't be doing that, and I'm taking it serious. But yeah, there is this. But I think there is always an interest in physical materials. Absolutely.
Hi, thank you for your presentation, and very interesting to see collections made digital that are accessible around the world. I'm just wondering, when you partner, whoever is the owner of these documents or whatever, do you have some sort of agreement, some kind of, like, do you keep these available forever or for a period of time? And that kind of thing. I wonder if you could just say a few words about that.
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, first of all, we have a contract with the people that we work with, just very simple. We pay you, you digitize. That's a very kind of transactional contract. But then about the material, that is an interesting question also, because in order to upload this in Wikimedia, whoever owns the copyright, in the case of the Lagos architect, Nigerian architect, it was the family. They have to, for the materials that are uploaded, so it doesn't mean everything, but they have to allow for the material to be in the public domain. And so to kind of, you don't give away your copyright, but you're not claiming that. So that requires also a contract, in fact, a contract, something between Wikimedia and the family in this case. So there's different levels of, let's say, agreements. And so the goal is to make this material available for a wider and broader audience, and especially when it comes to, I think, the work of African architects. There is such a large diaspora, so the access to this material is really crucial for Nigerians not being in Nigeria. But so the actual digital files are kept by, in this case, the university, the River State University, which is the people that we collaborated with, and we don't have and we don't own the digital files. It's their responsibility, but as long as Wikimedia exists, it will be available. Now, will that ever go down? Who knows? But I hope not, but for a long time, I guess. Yeah, and you can download also the images. You could go online and download them all on your own disk and do whatever you with it what you want.
Thank you. Just another question. When you do original titles, story title versus description of something, do you still maintain the original title somewhere or make it searchable?
Yes, that's a very good question. The critical cataloging project. Yes, we never erase a description. And so in our database, we have actually multiple descriptions often, because also over time, things have already changed before, let's say, we are now addressing it over the last. So often an object, especially drawings of, let's say, 15th, 16th, 17th century, they have multiple descriptions. Sometimes there's something written on the back. Very seldomly it is an official artist title. It's often something made up by a dealer, or there is, or the vendor, or over time, and especially if an object is quite old, things have gained multiple descriptions, let's say, or multiple titles, and there is the title, and then you have a description, and both of those have, let's say, there are different iterations, and you also see this is a very interesting idea of all these databases that we have, and this is amazing that we have the databases, obviously. But in a way, sometimes I think it would be great if we go back to a card system, just an index, because there what you see is what you have in a way. And definitely at the CCA and in any institution, of course, we went from a card system, like a paper index system, to the first database, and then from the first database migrated to the next database, and you gain a lot with all these new databases, but you also lose. So this is a very interesting project also, or a subject in itself. We keep all these descriptions. Unfortunately, in our current website, you cannot see all the different descriptions. I hope really, we are working on a new website, and I really hope that we can show, it's just a matter of, let's say, which fields are being fed to the website. So now you see a preferred, let's say, we have in our database, you can, let's say, prioritize descriptions. But we would like to be much more transparent and show all these different descriptions. So now, if you would search for the word quarters, in that case of the Walker Evans photograph, you would find the photo, but you would not really understand, because in the description that you see online, you don't see that word anymore. So the database will spit it out, but you don't understand why it is there. And I really hope that in the new website, we can give a much more layered, let's say, more layers of the description, and also the evolution of description, or evolution, whatever you want to call it. Yeah. There's also one in the back, I think.
David, go ahead.
I'm a curator of the science museum here, and I collected really big things, several comments while I was here. So what I love about what you're doing, Dr. Westland is too dispersed collection of things that are 3 times the extent of Ottawa. Dr. Wall use them as you're doing to build a know-how, the process of connecting and building a community around that process. And so I really love what you were doing with the pictures there. And it's inspired me to think about even something that I'm looking at right now on the top of Mount Kate in Hawaii. It might be very motivating, but just that whole community of people, experts, maybe some conservation people, and sort of the visualization people, just to observe the heck out of it. This can't get quite focused, but the best we can do, but in that process, how great and inspiring it is that we can really have a much knowledge and community.
Yeah, and I also think, let's say, there's one part of, let's say, documenting, as you were saying, which is also the work that we do of these drawings. But then I think it becomes really interesting that other people start to reflect on it. So I sometimes receive emails from Sudanese people in the diaspora, and they say, can I just add descriptions on Wikimedia? Because Wikimedia is an open source. Anybody can add or edit the captions or the metadata to a certain extent. And so this is really interesting. So they say, well, I actually know more about this building I would like to add, which is fantastic, let's say. That becomes, these are people that I've never met, I will probably never meet. Yeah. Yeah. How do I reach consensus on?
Revised titles. Revised titles.
Oh, yeah, well, it takes a lot of time. Yeah, that's a very good question. Sometimes we don't, I guess. But I think what is, let's say, this is the big problem also, I think. It's very, you really get into rabbit holes in the sense that you can do research about one object. And again, we have so many materials that we cannot do. Also, we're not writing a PhD on every single subject. So it's really, we have to keep in mind all the time that it is about access and discoverability. So in a way, the more words you use, the better, or the more tags or keywords because then people can find it and can do their own research. I don't want to do the research for others. It's really about making this material. First of all, let's say the first objective of the project was to really discuss harmful language, which is something that many libraries and collections are doing. So they are circulating on the internet a lot of lists of harmful language, which, by the way, is already changing, because I think already the word enslaved is now, in a certain group in the United States, is being questioned again, because they say, well, actually they were slaves. So, there's a lot of opinions also about this. So it's really interesting. We have a reading club, so we read articles about it, so we try to at least understand as much as possible. And this is an institution-wide effort. But yeah, we try to, let's say, really keep access and discoverability as the main goal, and not and to be as accurate as possible. And sometimes, for example, in many of our objects, there was no geographical locations, and that requires research. It's not super difficult nowadays with, let's say, Google Lens, and you can do a lot of, let's say, image search now. And sometimes we get reflections from the public that also helps us. So it's really, yeah, how do you reach consensus? At one point, we try to be concise, while at the same time allow for as much discoverability as we can imagine. But yeah, sometimes we don't, and in consensus also.
Martien, maybe I'll just ask a closing question. When you were rounding up your talk, you spoke about ethical values. But I'm wondering if in this journey, if you and your team have been moral questions, and what would be the kind of, I don't even know how to, in a way, get my head wrapped around it. I completely see the ethical side, and the ethical dilemmas, and also the ethical, the relational ethics you have in setting up these new systems of systems in a way.
Yeah.
But what have been perhaps some of the moral questions, or have researchers brought moral questions forward?
Yeah, definitely. Well, as I also said, collecting in itself is very complex, and I think we've all become much more aware. That's a moral question, I think. Yeah, absolutely. And so in many ways, it's trying, as I said, not to try to find a one-size-fits-all, but and I think a lot of these things are case by case and are changing also. Yeah, so anyway, let's say we have a lot of these kind of questions, and also, for example, very complex question about, let's say, moral questions is who you give access to. We have a big debate inside the institution about publishing materials of the Van Ginkel archive, in fact, of images of, for example, residential schools. And so this, let's say we've digitized materials, and someone wants to write an article about this. And so the question is, should we publish these images that are most likely very harmful for certain people and certain groups of people? And so on the one hand, there are, let's say, the moral dilemma is that there's a group in the CCA that says we should make everything accessible. It's really important to also stimulate debate and stimulate the discourse. And there's another group of people in the CCA that says, no, we should be really careful. We should ask the community for advice, but the community also is not maybe all thinking the same. So these are really moral dilemmas that we haven't solved, really, I have to say. So we haven't published this article yet. And we keep, let's say, thinking about it. It's very complex. And for sure, other libraries and museums are in the same position. And we also talk about this. This is actually very interesting, that through the Towards Home project, which was about the Arctic North, not just in Canada, but also in Scandinavia, so North and South. And we So we've been discussing with our peers in the Swedish Architecture Institute and also the Norwegian Architecture Institute who have the same questions. We have, let's say, Zoom meetings every 2-3 months with them about our common questions and moral dilemmas, exactly. And now also, which makes it complex time-wise, but with the librarian of the Auckland University Archive, who deals with their indigenous materials. So it's a very interesting, we all deal with the same dilemmas and moral issues. At the same time, it's very important for us to then, touch base and to talk about it. Yeah. But let's say materials of indigenous communities in particular is very complex and, let's say, gives us a lot of moral questions.
I think what's so exciting about what we've learned this evening is that you're really speaking about a new frontier of museology.
Yeah, definitely,
and
yes.
very much,
Yeah.
and the power of computing on the one hand allows it, but there's also this power of, in a way, global networks and reconciliation between people that produces these great forms of knowledge. So Martien, thank you very much.
Thank you. Pleasure.